Okay, so in part one, I talked about what citing is and why we do it. In part two, I discussed some of the pitfalls of plagiarism. Now in part three, it's time to get down to the business of actually citing sources correctly and smoothly in your paper. Please keep in mind this presentation is just an introduction, and you should always consult your teacher if you have questions about some of the specific details. I want to start with the first rule of citing any kind of information in your paper. Less is more. As you can see here in this information, it's good to use the least amount of information, the shortest quotation possible that will allow you to make your point and then move back into your own ideas. Keep in mind, this is your paper, not a collection of information from your sources, so as little as it takes to make your point is just the amount you should use. So basically, when you decide you want to use information from a source in your paper, there are three ways to do it. Now, a skilled writer will use all three of these ways and vary up their methods, blending a combination of direct quotation, some paraphrase, and some summary into their paper. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about each of these ways of bringing information into your paper. The first way is probably the most common, and it's very useful because it allows you to take the direct wording of someone else into your paper and use it legitimately and fairly without committing plagiarism, as long as you follow the rules mentioned in the previous presentation. Sometimes the best way to say something has already been said. And when the wording in your source is particularly rich, vivid, or specific, you're really best off to quote it directly. If you recall the quotation from part 2 regarding the shards in a kaleidoscope, in that case, I would quote that source directly. It was well said. I can't say it any better. I'm going to put it in quotations, give credit to the source, and move on to my ideas. A few guidelines here. The first two are for review, and the third bullet point I'll discuss in more detail in the next couple of slides. But these are just reminders to avoid plagiarism. Any wording that you take directly from your source needs to be placed within quotation marks. One thing that a lot of student writers forget to do, or maybe just haven't been taught how to do, is to use a signal phrase to introduce a direct quotation. What you see in a lot of student papers is a sentence that begins and ends with quotation marks. Maybe there's a parenthetical notation or footnote at the end, but that's really a sign that the writer doesn't know how to correctly handle directly quoted information. So whenever you decide to quote a source verbatim in your paper, you must introduce the source with a signal phrase. Like the name implies, a signal phrase signals to your reader that you're about to quote someone directly and informs your reader that they're about to hear from someone else besides you. One kind of easy way to remember this, think of a signal phrase as kind of like a turn signal. You signal that you're going to make a turn in your car just before you turn or shortly before you turn, and it gives people around you an idea that you're about to make a move in a different direction. And that's exactly what a signal phrase does. It tells your reader, I'm about to move from my thoughts into someone else's. The lack of a signal phrase in a research paper results in what's often nicely called a floating quotation. And it's a pretty easy problem to fix, but when a teacher or a expert reads a paper and they see a floating quotation, it really screams amateur. It simply kind of reduces your credibility with your reader because it kind of says, I'm not really sure how to handle quotations in my paper. But these are so easy to fix if you'll just add a signal phrase every time you quote somebody else in your paper. The other way to handle information from your sources is to paraphrase or summarize your ideas. And these are very useful when you want to blend an idea, maybe a statistic or some other fact, into your own wording. In this case, you'll just paraphrase or summarize. The main difference between paraphrasing and summarizing is that a paraphrase is usually a rewrite of a single sentence or phrase, and it's still about the same length as the original, but for a variety of reasons you may want to put that wording into your own. Remember, you still have to cite it, but you've completely reworded it. A summary, on the other hand, takes a long piece of information, perhaps a paragraph or a page, and reduces it. And so in that case you're taking a longer piece of information and reducing it, summarizing it in your own words. Again, you still have to cite it, but this is another way to use outside information in your paper. Here's an example I'm not real crazy about, but it works pretty well. If I were to take the quotation that we used in the previous part of this slideshow and to paraphrase it, you can see how I might do that here. Again, I'm not real crazy about my own wording. I think the original wording's a lot better, but just to kind of give you an example of what a paraphrase looks like, you'll find here that the wording is different from the original, but the idea is the same. I've still cited it parenthetically, but I've decided not to quote it in this particular paper. I'm going to end this presentation, or this part of the presentation, with a second rule that will help you be sure that you're paraphrasing correctly. And I call this the 3-word rule. You can read this rule for a moment and think about it. You may want to rewind this presentation and see if I followed this 3-word rule in the previous slide. I hope I did, because I'm going to be pretty embarrassed if I plagiarized in my PowerPoint presentation about how to cite things correctly. But check it out and see if I did it right.